Hello, and thank you all for joining us for our fifth episode in our ongoing series about medical cannabis. Today, we'll be discussing homemade edibles and homemade oils. My name is Barb. I've been working in the licensed producer system for over 5 years and have extensive experience in supporting and educating patients, as well as developing policy that is focused on patient care. I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Johnathan.
Thank you so much, Barb. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight for episode 5 already. I am Johnathan. I lead up the cannabis counseling team at Canadian Cannabis Clinics. I practiced in pain management for 17 years, and I've studied cannabis for about 25 years. As always, please note, Barb and I are not physicians, and we're not providing specific medical advice during this webinar series.
Okay, so let's get started with the very basics, and that is, what is a cannabis edible? Now, if you joined us last time on our 4th episode, we discussed the edible oil medical cannabis products that are currently available via the licensed producer system and how to use them. Now, we highly recommend that you revisit that episode on our YouTube channel. It will really help to give you some background information as we continue to discuss using cannabis in edible form. Now, you can do so by visiting youtube.com and simply doing a search for Cannabis Clinics Webinar Episode 4.
Absolutely. And today we're going to go one step further, actually, and focus on food edibles, and most importantly, how to make them yourself at home.
Now, what form do edibles come in, Johnathan?
Yeah, so many for sure, Barb, as you know. And you hear a lot these days about baked goods like the ever popular cannabis brownies or cookies. Edibles have also popped up in a number of other forms, though, including a variety of candies. So gummy bears, chocolates and lollipops and drinks are very popular. There even a number of chefs are now specializing in entire meal plans that are cannabis infused. So Barb, are edibles legal to buy in stores or the dispensaries currently?
So the short answer on that, Johnathan, is no. Now, however, on October 17th, when cannabis is legalized and sold to recreational users in Canada, both dried flower or bud and edible oils will be available, with Health Canada looking towards allowing the sale of other standardized regulated edible products in about 2019 or so. Now, in the meantime, a lot of patients do want to know why they simply can't go to a dispensary and buy a brownie or a package of gummy bears.
Yeah, and the reasons just tie into why it's not recommended to buy any cannabis at a dispensary. It will not have come from a facility that is regulated and adhering to safety standards and accurate labeling. I know that we might sound like a couple of party poopers here, but when approaching cannabis as medicine, these factors are extremely important, Barb.
Exactly. And with edibles that are purchased, let's say, over the counter, it is impossible, or very difficult at least, to verify what strain of cannabis has been used, where on the Sativa Indica spectrum it may lie, what the THC or CBD levels are, or really how potent that edible is. Now, additionally, in the case of food products, any food product that's sold to the public at large, it must conform to safe food production guidelines. I often ask my patients this, and that is, would you eat at a restaurant that has not been inspected for a clean kitchen and proper food handling procedure? Would you trust your health and well-being to, let's say, any product when you have no assurance as to its exact ingredients and how it was made? These are really important questions to really ask at any time, and especially when addressing medical symptoms.
Yeah, and there will come a time in the near future when these types of products will likely be quite widely available. But as with anything we put in our bodies, they should be regulated and safe to use. The day will come, but we're not quite there yet. So the good news, though, in the meantime, medical patients are legally permitted to convert their dried cannabis to any edible form they wish in the comfort of their own home. So while you currently can't buy edible products outside of LP oils, you certainly can experiment all you like with your cannabis at home. So Barb, maybe you can speak to the benefits of using cannabis in an edible form.
Of course. And now extractions and edibles, once they're made, they have relatively little odor, they're discreet and very easy to store and travel with. Edible doses can be measured more precisely than inhaled cannabis, and that can allow for more efficient and consistent treatment of symptoms. Cannabis edibles, especially foods that are infused with a cannabis oil, they're generally just more pleasant to ingest. For example, a cannabis oil or butter can be added to any food recipe, pasta sauce, or used in baking brownies or cookies. And this can really be an ideal option for individuals individuals who maybe previously have had difficulty, let's say, with the taste or the smell of cannabis products?
So true. And we're all familiar with the idea of smoking a joint, a cannabis cigarette, of course. However, we really have moved quite far beyond burning cannabis in paper in modern cannabinoid therapy. Smoking cannabis is actually among the least effective ways to deliver cannabinoids because a high percentage of the medicinal compounds are destroyed when burned. Not always the case, but very highly. So your medication is therefore less effective, and consequently, both your money and your medicine are literally going up in smoke. So eliminating the need to smoke also reduces the risk of exposure to carcinogens, which, as cancer risks, are a serious concern, obviously. And patients with compromised lung function or sensitivity may find that ingesting orally is just preferable and with fewer negative side effects. So using edibles also eliminates the need for additional devices. And while a vaporizer is an excellent option for those who do wish to inhale their medication, they can sometimes be challenging to use and maintain, especially for those who have difficulty using their hands or for those who just find the technology to be a bit challenging. So with edibles, no vaporizer, no screens, no cleaning time, no rolling papers, no extra hassle, Barb.
It's true. And, you know, a real tangible benefit as well of ingesting cannabis orally is the duration and the potency. Now, as we've mentioned before, cannabis that is ingested will take anywhere from about 30 to 90 minutes to take effect, but it can last for 8 hours or even longer. Now, most patients find relief for at least 5 hours, and that makes edibles a really great option for those who need longer lasting effectiveness during both the day and overnight. Lastly, as well, you know, cooking can be such a wonderfully relaxing and very rewarding experience.
Yeah.
Plus, when using legally obtained medicinal cannabis from a licensed producer to make your edibles, you also have the assurance that you are using a safe medication that you yourself created with ingredients that you trust. So important. Now, the next question we often hear is what are the effects of edibles? And the effect of your edible, it really largely depends on the type of cannabis that was used to create it, and of course, how much of it you've ingested. Now, again, going back, we definitely encourage you to review episode 1, where we discuss the basics, the differences between THC and CBD, as well as the cannabis spectrum. But in the meantime, here is a quick recap for you.
So CBD does not have psychoactive effects, so it will not generally create those feelings of euphoria or being high. CBD is generally considered safe to use and does not carry a high risk of taking too much or creating an adverse effect. So a dose of CBD should not have the same effects in terms of the level of impairment as a dose of THC would. THC, on the other hand, will have a psychoactive effect and can lead to feelings of euphoria and feeling high. So as with all cannabis, you may find a difference in reaction depending on what part of that Indica Sativa spectrum that the cannabis used in your edible lies. So again, going back to the very basics, Indica-based edibles will generally have a more sedative effect. Sativa-based edibles may have a more energizing effect, and edibles using a hybrid strain of cannabis may display either or both characteristics to varying degrees. It's important to restate that the effects of cannabis will also vary from individual to individual, based on a wide number of factors.
And that being said, and we really cannot emphasize this enough, cannabis that is ingested orally, it may have a different, longer lasting, and often much more powerful effect than inhaled cannabis. And that is especially with regard to the psychoactive response from THC. And this is why we always caution patients to start low and go slow. Do not ingest too much at once, and always wait at least 8 hours between doses. So again, to speak to what to expect when using an edible, well, patients who are using edibles successfully may notice the following depending on the type of cannabis that's being used. An overall reduction in symptoms, whether it be pain, anxiety, sleeplessness, muscle spasms, a lack of energy, a lack of appetite, and again, a noticing of increased mobility. Given the potency of edibles as well and their longer lasting properties, patients who are using them, they often do report extended relief times as well. So let's maybe get to the practical aspect now of creating edibles. And let's start with preparing your cannabis and what your options are there.
Sure, so let's start with the nuts and bolts of creating edibles, and that's how to prepare your cannabis to make your edibles. So We respect some of our more experienced cannabis users will have their own preferences. Maybe they've developed them over the years with regard to creating edibles. But because these webinars are geared towards cannabis novices, we're going to keep things as simple as possible. With time and investigation, many people will find the best method that suits their needs. So Barb, we hear this question frequently. Can't I just eat my cannabis buds as they are?
Now, any benefits to eating, let's call it raw cannabis, have not quite yet been clinically proven. It is currently generally accepted that cannabis is really most effective when the medicinal compounds are activated. And that activation is achieved by heat. And that process is called decarboxylation.
What's it called again?
It's called decarboxylation or
Perfect.
decarbing. You'll hear us refer to it as. Now, simply ingesting your bud, let's say right out of the container, it's going to have little to no effect. Plus, it won't be very pleasant tasting. So let's talk about your options when it comes to incorporating cannabis into food. Probably one of the easiest and again, most frequent questions we hear, Jonathan, and I'm sure you'll agree, is can't I just add ground cannabis to my butter or my sauce?
You know, we certainly hear that all the time. And it can be tempting to simply grind your bud and add it to a batter or a dough, let's say, or pasta sauce, whatever. But it's probably not really going to be your best option, and there's a few reasons for that. So inconsistent dosage due to uneven distribution, you could end up with one dose being really unpleasant because you got way too much medication, and then another dose not having any relief at all. As well, taste and mouthfeel. It can be really unpleasant to chew a food that has ground up cannabis plant in it. It gets stuck in the teeth. It's a gritty feel, generally tastes rather unpleasant. So heat in baking may not be enough to fully activate the cannabinoids, which can lead to a waste of medication in this case too.
Absolutely, and instead we find, and patients often report, that edible recipes are often more successful when a cannabutter or an oil extraction is used. That way you get a more consistent dosage with evenly distributed medication, and again, a more pleasant taste, easier to consume.
And on the whole, easier to work with for sure. And patients can establish their dosage before creating their edibles. So as well, cannabinoids are more effective, of course, and also best extracted into a fat such as an oil or butter.
Yes, and by using this method, your extraction is essentially bioavailable, and that means it's ready to use. You can essentially consume it just as it is, on its own, off of a spoon, or you can add it to a warm beverage, spread your dosage on toast. You can stir your dosage into a prepared pasta dish, sprinkle oil on salad, or really any other meal item. Now, that being said, one important thing to remember is that subjecting your decarboxylated or decarbed cannabis, cannabutter, or oil to a further higher temperature for an extended period of time, it can diminish potency and therefore efficacy. So essentially how well your medicine works. So do keep this in mind.
Yeah, so true. And for example, if you're making a pasta sauce, don't use your cannabutter or oil to make the sauce sort of from scratch. Rather, add that dose of your cannabis oil or butter to your individual serving at service time. And then in the case of baked goods like brownies or cookies, you must be sure to minimize baking temperatures, 350 degrees max, and duration, you really want to keep it at 20 minutes at the upper end. Barb.
Exactly. Just keep that temperature low, and do keep in mind that added heat will further degrade cannabinoids. But again, this is an extraordinarily popular and reliable and effective way to medicate, and has been for quite some time. But really, taking that extra simple step of creating an extraction, it's likely going to yield better results on the whole. So on to decarboxylation, or decarbing as we like to say, and we've got a little saying, and that is roast, not toast.
Yep. So here, you're going to set the oven rack to the middle position and preheat your oven to 310 degrees Fahrenheit. You're going to grind or break up that cannabis with your fingers or using a grinder. And you'll want a consistency to that closer of a fine grind to increase the surface area. And place that ground cannabis on your cookie sheet and place it in the oven for 11 to 13 minutes. Some people choose to lay a sheet of aluminum foil over it, but if you do so, don't wrap that aluminum foil around the edges of the sheet. Just make a loose tent. Then you're going to remove that cookie sheet from the oven and quickly and carefully remove the cannabis and place it aside. you have now successfully decarbed your cannabis. So it's now ready to use. You can sprinkle it on, say, a pudding, for example, or granola. You can add it to a finished sauce or a salad, as Barb has said. Even putting it in capsules, as many people do. Your decarbed cannabis can indeed be added to just about any recipe, keeping in mind that further extended heat may affect potency, of course. So, Barb, how do we make our own cannabis butter or oil at home?
Okay, so we're going to start with a recipe that uses 5 grams of cannabis. And again, I'm just going to make it clear for our listeners. If you are choosing this option, you will not need to decarb your cannabis ahead of time. It will automatically decarb during the cooking process, so you can skip that extra baking step. What you're going to need is 5 grams of 5 grams, pardon me, of ground cannabis, a half a cup of coconut oil or butter, and half a cup of water or so as needed. You're going to start by taking a medium saucepan and placing it on the small burner of the stovetop. Add your oil and your water and heat that on medium-low for about 5 minutes. Now at that point, you're going to add your cannabis to the oil and water. Lower the temperature to the lowest setting on the burner. And at this point now, you're going to be spending some time with this extraction. You're going to want to stir continuously for 30 minutes up to 60 minutes, being careful to not scorch or overheat the oil. It's really important, just low temperature, plenty of stirring.
Yep, so true. And then you're going to remove it from the heat, allow it to cool for a few minutes, and then you're going to strain it through cheesecloth into a glass vessel to separate the plant matter. And carefully squeeze that cheesecloth to expel all of your extraction. Now, at this point, some people choose to add a little cocoa powder or other flavoring to improve the taste for them. And you'll notice that this extract is not going to be a clear product. And depending on the type of cannabis used and how long you spend it's spent on the stovetop, it could appear anywhere from a light green, sort of olive color, to even a light brown or even a honey color. And so you're going to store that glass container in the fridge to allow it to solidify. And once it has, you're going to remove it and take out any residual water that's going to be remaining in that jar. So you just have your solidified butter. And that's it. You've decarboxylated cannabis-infused butter or oil that's all ready to use, Barb.
Of course, and now this recipe can be doubled or tripled as needed. Just keep in mind, if you are making a larger batch, separate the batch and store it in smaller separate containers to use as needed. Consistency is really key when storing homemade cannabis butters and oils. They should be stored in the fridge, preferably on a shelf in the center, rather than on a shelf in the door. This basically ensures consistent refrigeration. Of course, use the best and highest quality ingredients that you can find, fresh butter and fresh oil, to really maximize that shelf life. Now, if efficacy diminishes or you notice a change in smell or appearance that just kind of looks to be not right, it may be time to dispose of that batch. And to dispose of your extraction, your oil or your butter, simply put it in the compost, or you can rinse with hot water down the drain.
But hopefully we'll use it before that.
Exactly, exactly. Now, the next big question, and I think this is a very important one, is how much cannabis should I be taking and how to dose?
Yeah, and we really wish there was just a simple answer to that and, say take X amount each time, but it's not that easy. As we've discussed in previous episodes, the type of cannabis being used, the symptoms that are being addressed, other medications perhaps being used as well, and the patient's unique response to medical cannabis are all going to be factors to consider here.
Exactly, and 2 things that we always mention: journaling to find your ideal dosage and titrating upwards slowly over the course of a few weeks as you do so. Again, start low and go slow.
And if you are making Cannabutter or oil, either to take on its own or to use in a recipe, a good strategy is to first establish just how much a dose is for you and incorporate that into the recipe. Most commonly, patients will start with a dosage of, say, 1/8 to 1/4 of a teaspoon. And it's really important when adding oil or butter to any baked good recipe to ensure thorough distribution all throughout. This helps to administer consistent dosages and avoid any negative side effects from a dose that may be too high, as I mentioned earlier. An even better strategy, rather than mixing that oil throughout the dough or the batter, form the cookies or brownies first and just add that single dose to each one.
Absolutely. And again, hopefully you'll have already established your optimum dosage by first testing your extraction on its own, just to test the effects and the duration. So let's say that you've made cookies or brownies using the guideline that we've offered above. As we mentioned, a good starting point is 1/8 to 1/4 of a teaspoon of cannabis oil or butter, and that is per piece.
Yeah.
So per cookie, per brownie. And remember to record in your journal how much product is in each cookie or piece of your batch.
Yeah, and if you're new to this, we strongly recommend do not eat one whole cookie right away. And much, much better to do this whole process slowly rather than to take too much and have an unpleasant experience. So work your way up in increments, like 1/4 of a cookie or even 1/8 of a cookie. Make note of the time that you took it. You should be feeling some effects within, say, half an hour, up to, again, about maybe 2 hours. Record any change in symptoms and mood. Even if you don't feel any effects, resist that urge to eat more within that initial 8-hour period. In fact, if you don't feel any effects, wait until the next day. Try a larger or smaller increment based on your previous reaction. And if you feel that a certain amount of a cookie or edible was too strong, you're going to try less the next time. And as Barb keeps emphasizing, continue to journal and titrate upwards or downwards by just those very small increments of your edible until, again, you find that optimal dosage. And as you become more comfortable with the process, you may want to experiment with different types of carrier oils and making different extracts to address different symptoms, perhaps one for daytime, one for nighttime, which is very popular, Barb, of course.
Exactly. And so as our last point of discussion, let's get to the really good stuff, and that is being creative with your medibles. So let's talk recipes. Now, there are a ton of books and websites out there with a number of different recipes, and certainly you can explore the many options out there that are available once you've mastered your Cannabutter or cannabis oil preparation skills.
Yeah, so true. And I just want to mention that you do not have to stick with the sweet stuff, especially for those who are looking, to limit caloric intake.
Absolutely. Decarbed Cannabutter or oil can be used on popcorn.
Yeah.
You can even use an oil atomizer. That's one of those devices where you put your oil in and you just pump and the sprays come out. Now, do keep in mind.
One pump at a time.
Exactly. If you're using this method, you will want to, just as with your cookie, titrate upwards slowly, spray by spray. Additionally, your oil can be mixed in with a pasta, used to create a pesto. You can add your butter to baked mashed potatoes, toss it with your steamed veggies, or even stir it into your morning coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. And as many of our patients know, that is a preference of mine, my CBD butter in my coffee in the morning.
Absolutely. And I think that starting the day symptom-free is always a good way to start your day.
I love that. I love that.
Okay, so we are now headed to the Q&A section of our program.
Right.
As always, we've got our live team here to answer questions in the chat. So do feel free to type in your questions into the chat box. You can also forward any questions to our team at webinar@canvasrx.com, and we'll certainly follow up with you. So on to your questions. Let's see here. So I've got a first question here, and this is a really great one, and I'm glad that it was asked. Can I use my leftover cannabis from my vaporizer, to make an oil or Cannabutter?
Yeah, and I'd like to take that. And people certainly do this, absolutely. However, given how effective and how efficient vaporizers are nowadays, they do such a good job of extracting all of the viable cannabinoids and other compounds that usually what you have left in the end is really, really depleted. It's going to be significantly less potent. If, however, that vaporizer isn't terribly effective, or efficient rather, you may have a little bit more to work with. But generally speaking, some people will find that even when they do have a very good quality vaporizer and they use their vaped cannabis to make an edible, it's just a lower potency. And they wind up learning how to dose with that, and that becomes a great second go at their medication.
Exactly. I mean, I think when you're a patient and you're living on a limited income and you really want to get the most out of your cannabis, certainly, creating an oil or a butter from the from what's left in your vaporizer, it is a viable option, and there will be some left. Probably, again, as Johnathan mentioned, the newer vaporizers are extremely efficient. But if you're working with an older model, perhaps that is not quite as efficient, you may still find that you're getting something out of your medication. So you certainly can use that. Again, keeping in mind that if you are going to go that route, you do not need to decarb your cannabis. And it is going to come out less of that sort of olive green color usually.
Oh, it's going to be brown.
It's going to be brown. So, so there you go. Okay, so moving on to our next question here. This one is coming from John. This is a pretty involved one. So I have 24/7 pain caused by damaged nerves. Sometimes the attacks can be likened to a 10-inch nail being driven into your ribs. Oh boy, John, that is tough to hear. Now, John is hoping that a cannabis byproduct or a product could produce something that would help with the pain. Is there something that can be recommended? He's looking for something powerful and something that would not require such frequent doses.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have certainly seen many patients with unresponsive pain, unresponsive to other therapies and medications, and then they respond really well to cannabis, especially high CBD, lower THC products in the case of neuropathic and inflammatory pain, especially oils and edibles. And speaking of cost, again, you could purchase a dried strain and make your own edible at home to experiment a little bit that way. You could make just a simple butter or oil and just use it as is. And I would really, I'd really love to hear what the results were if John gives us a try, because that does sound absolutely dreadful.
Yeah, it does. And I think, again, in John's case, it's a two-step process in that there is always going to be what I like to call the period of investigation. Sometimes we wish that cannabis is that magic bullet and the first strain that you try is going to be the one that works.
Sometimes it happens.
Sometimes it happens. Yeah. I mean, certainly it is something that we've seen. But to be ready to certainly try, start with CBD, start with low THC, high CBD, because again, when patients often say powerful, they may think that it is something on a very strong THC end of things, something with a very strong psychoactive property. And that may not always be the case, again, because it varies from patient to patient. So John, my advice for you would be to first find that strain or those strains that are going to work best for you. And then in terms of length of efficacy, because you are looking for a longer term relief, definitely going that edible route. So if it's coming from an edible oil from a licensed producer, or as Johnathan mentioned, if you found the strains that work for you and you're making an oil or a Cannabutter at home, that's probably going to be something that may yield some results for you.
And just a last thought on that. Vaping for breakthrough pain could also be a viable option here, whether a high CBD product or whatever.
Absolutely. I mean, even though we are talking about edibles today, vaping is a very, very handy thing. And it's often not just one or the other. Sometimes it is a combination of both. And as Johnathan mentioned, edibles are great for longer term relief. But let's say you do have a spike in pain or you just need something to get you over the hump while you're waiting for your edibles to kick in. A vaporizer can be very, very helpful and can be certainly very useful to inhale your cannabis.
I hope that helped, John.
Okay.
I see one down further. Do you want to take this one?
The one from Kathy and Chris?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so Kathy and Chris ask, I would like some dosing information on edibles as I find it confusing. I know how much to vape to feel the desired effects, but how do I figure out how much I should ingest for the same or near same effect?
So Kathy, Chris, glad you asked. The simple answer is to start low and go slow. I mean, there's no reason to rush the process of determining what's going to work for you, especially because there is a real risk of using too much and winding up with quite an unpleasant experience for some hours.
Exactly. And again, I'm going to chime in here as I always do. And this really is where journaling becomes such an effective tool because you're going to know your baseline. Let's say I know I feel like this when I inhale cannabis. And so when you're moving to using or trying to find that same level of relief using another method, again, you're going to want to establish the baseline and then work your way slowly up. So again, record every time you use it, what you've used, when you've taken it, and again, really record to minute detail the effects on your change in mood, the effect on your change in symptoms, again, whether it be pain or any other symptom. And really, it's going to take a little bit of homework, but for the most part, patients usually find that sort of, let's say, sweet spot within a few weeks of investigation. Okay, so let's move right along here. I have this question, and I find this an interesting question. Can I use my oils for my licensed producer to cook with?
Oh yeah, and yes, you can. Again, actually, when the first
I know I
company,
threw that one at you, Johnathan.
Okay, no, the very first licensed producer that came out with oils no longer exists actually, but they came out with a wonderful assortment of they had a pancake mix and other batter mix, etc. So they specifically had these basically just stir and go type of recipes for that type of food that you could add your oil to. The caveat there is, as we mentioned earlier, anytime you subject, so the oils that you buy from a licensed producer in Canada are bioavailable. They've been decarboxylated.
Yeah.
So if you're now going to take that oil and subject it to a heat process, you're going to potentially diminish some of the capacity or the efficacy of it.
Absolutely. So again, as we mentioned, with your oils from your LP, probably your better bet would be again to, take your dropper, put your dosage on a cookie, or add it into a pudding, or again, you can, if you've got a pasta dish ready to go, put it in at service time, and that's going to be your best option there.
In most cases, but you can bake with it. Just keep that temperature, keep the temperature 350, absolute max, and keep that duration to the upper limit was 20 minutes, basically.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
And experiment and journal. Yeah.
Exactly, experiment and journal. Okay, let's see. I've got a question here from Marianne. So how does edible oil combine with water-based food and beverages? I can see it working in solids like brownies, but how about sauces and teas? It would float. And that is very, very true. Any oil is going to float on top of a water. Now, for this reason, Johnathan mentioned he takes his oil or butter in coffee. What you're going to want to do when you're adding that oil into any sort of quite hot beverage, if you can avoid, I would say probably more of a lukewarm, like a medium lukewarm, not boiling hot. That's a good start. And also too, in the case of coffee, you're really going to want to froth it in there, really stir it in very, very well.
I actually use a frother sometimes when I add it. I sometimes do that literally.
Exactly, because butter in coffee is actually very delicious.
It is.
It's really, really good, and it certainly can be done. Now, because it is in an oil form, it's not likely to stick too much to the sides of the container. But another way around it, if you do want to take your oil, let's say in a beverage, is to just take the scale down and almost take a small amount, almost like a shot.
Or just half a mouthful.
Or just half a mouthful. Drop your oil in and just take it back and swallow, and you should be good to go. So now, Marianne also asked about sauces. Now, sauces are different. And again, speaking of working with cannabis butter or an oil that's already bioavailable and ready to go, it's very easy to, let's say, in your pasta sauce for your serving, just again, pop that eighth of a teaspoon, quarter of a teaspoon, half a teaspoon, however much you're taking. Just put it right on top there and mix it in with your serving portion
at service time.
At service time, and that's really going to be your best option at that point. So I hope that has given some answers there. Let's see here. I've got another question about decarbing. Okay, so let's go back to decarbing for a second, because I do think it's really important. Decarbing is a mystery. Some say that baking or cooking the food product is enough, while others say that the inside doesn't get hot for long enough.
Both could be right.
Exactly. And so we did allude to that earlier when we were sort of speaking about whether or not we should just add our ground cannabis to a recipe. And again, that's why we really think that just taking that extra step of the hour or so to make a cannabis oil or butter is really going to take that off the table, because you know that it's going to be bioavailable, you know that it's going to be decarbed through that 30 to 60 minutes on the stovetop. So again, that's just really another reason of why you may want to go the extraction route, because it's true. It may very well be that your recipe doesn't cook long enough, and you may end up again with something that's not as effective as you'd like it to be.
Another huge factor. To have a proper independent oven thermometer can be supremely important with all of these type of processes. So decarbing can be a mystery. There are a number of rabbit holes on the internet that you can fall down for ever and ever and still come out completely undetermined. But again, just go back to some of these slides that we've talked about. Very simple processes for decarbing, creating your own extraction, and using it in any way you want to. It really should take a whole lot of the mystery out of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so let's just see here. How are we doing for time? It looks like, okay,
We're good.
We are good. All right, so at this point here, I'm going to just remind everyone to please do feel free to email us at webinar@canvasrx.com. Again, Jonathan and I, we definitely want to extend our big, big thank you for all of you for joining us today. And of course, behind the scenes, you cannot see, we've got a great team here. So thank you to VJ and to Andrew and to our counselors,
Megan and
Megan and Chev, who are out there answering your questions online. Again, if your question wasn't answered today, please do fear not. I know that that our team's going to be online for a little while after the webinar to continue answering those online questions coming in. And again, do feel free to send us the questions at webinar@canvasrx. We'll be happy to follow up with you.